been a lot of people buying stocks and other securities in an unauthorized manner. I don't appreciate it. I don't condone it. I didn't allow it, but people are buying them anyway. Despite my warnings, some of you have continued to engage in such atrocities. I'd appreciate it if you'd refrain from any more unauthorized purchases of securities that I did not clear. We'll start maybe with quantum computing. I think that one's kind of funny. I didn't get too much hate on the hate meter, which would have been great. And that would have surely signaled it was a really good short. So that's unfortunate. But I did get enough hate that it's probably a good short or an okay short. There are very few people that understand quantum computing. It's a tough field. It's sort of trading on vibes right now. There's kind of the second derivative that's really important with vibes. Like a stock can only go from 1 to 6 or 8 to 30 and stay there if there's sort of incremental buyers, because what tends to happen is the guy that buys it at 30 is very impatient, as he should be, and kind of has to sell the stock in a week or a month or something. There are some of those players or buyers that will hold it. Maybe Fidelity realizes it's a great buy at 30, even though it was just at 8, and they buy 10% of the company. That does happen. But most market participants are there because of momentum, and they will leave soon, whether there's stagnation in the price or rapid decline in the price. They're leaving either way. So their only way they stay is if the price keeps going up. And at some point, they sort of leave. So in terms of quantum specifically, like company specifics, we can get into that. But I think the problem is that this industry doesn't yet have an application. And it doesn't mean that one will never show up. But it more or less is a tool that doesn't exist yet and is still looking for an actual sort of solution. I've used Qiskit. I've done Q-Sharp. I did a big quantum journey while I was actually in jail. Renting these quantum computers isn't as hard as it looks. You can actually rent. IonQ only has one online functional quantum computer. It's trading for $7 billion. They're more or less behind in the quantum race. They're probably the best managed company, though. It'll be interesting to see how IonQ sort of works out, but it's just very unlikely that we're going to see real progress in this space. So sort of to take a step back and think about computing in general, and this is not as much my space as there's other people like 𝗩𝗡 and some other guys that really know what they're talking about. Maybe even John knows. But one of the problems with quantum computing is that you have to find a problem that's applicable to it. And if you do this, you can be really successful. NVIDIA got to a 3 trillion market cap on matmols. So, if you do actually get the right technique, you can do amazing things. But you're never going to run Windows or a web browser on quantum computing. You're not going to play a video game on it. That's not what it was built for. It was sort of built to do certain problems, or, we don't know what it's built for. It's just a cool trick. But one of the things we're thinking that it could be used for is to do decryption. And there are only so many parties that want to sort of play in that field. And you sort of know who they are, sort of governments and things like that. And then the other, so like integer factorization or Shor's algorithm or ECDSA or any other sort of encryption scheme. And there are quantum proof encryption schemes. And this is something that post-quantum cryptography, PQC, is something that NIST has advanced. And there's actually a recent big, love to hear from Bayes, actually. NIST has recently amped up its sort of PQC sort of preparedness. And many players like Ethereum. Ethereum has spent time, this is a cryptocurrency. Ethereum has spent a lot of time thinking about what's going to happen after quantum. So, there is a countermeasure to sort of integer factorization. And so that's sort of the one obvious thing that sort of jumps out. But there sort of is a countermeasure. And right now, classical computers are not just better than quantum computers, but quantum computers can barely factor, very, very small numbers. So the biggest dilemma here is this idea that, you have to get some kind of number that represents the logical qubit to physical qubit ratio. And we actually don't have that yet. There is no ratio in any existing quantum computer. We have 100 qubit quantum computers right now. and we're hoping to get sort of 200 or something like that. But it doesn't seem obvious that we can engineer 1,000 or a 5,000 or 10,000 qubit quantum computer. And with physical qubits, there's probably going to be something like 1,000 physical qubits to make so-called one logical qubit. And with a logical qubit, you probably need 2 logical qubits for every bit you're trying to break. So if you're trying to break RSA 2048-bit, you'd maybe need 4,000 logical qubits. And if your ratio of logical qubits to physical qubits is 1,000, you would need 4 million qubits. And it's just not clear that we can go from 100 qubits today to 4 million qubits later. Qubits are really hard to sort of work with. You know, for one, you have to be near absolute zero for most of the schemas, not all, but at least most of them. You have to be near absolute zero. Working in that environment's not easy. It is possible that, you know, there is a way to engineer something that scales fast. It doesn't seem likely given the current pace. So the idea of like the one killer app you have here, which is decryption, which is not like something you or I would ever want. We're not code breakers. We're not national security. The only people that want this are governments. And that doesn't mean it's a small business, but I think of it, instead of thinking of it like NVIDIA, where there's general purpose, I actually think of it more like Bruker. Bruker is a company that makes NMR machines. They're not exactly computers, but they're very, very expensive machines used in usually material science or biotechnology. And they're multi-million-dollar machines, and they sell very few of them. It's not that great of a business. Quantum computing is sort of like that. Just because NVIDIA did really well with their sort of coprocessor, if you will, using a sort of term from the past, doesn't mean that quantum computing will be the best coprocessor. It is amazing in a way, and so is NMR. NMR is amazing. But we've had all kinds of failed coprocessors over the years. One was the sound card. Sound was like a fundamentally different thing for computers to do. So there was a bunch of sound cards. Sound Blaster was the popular brand a long time ago. And we don't do sound cards anymore because the math that you need to do audio is just sort of math that you can do anyway. We've had all kinds of modems and other ideas of coprocessors, including math coprocessors that no longer sort of exist. So kind of what made GPUs special, I don't think necessarily applies to quantum. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't, figure something out years from now. But I think that this 1,000-to-1 ratio was not changed by Google's new advance, which is certainly exciting and interesting. But one of the things Google tends to get a lot of is this random circuit sampling. So random circuit sampling is very contrived. Very few people, even in quantum, think it's a real sort of useful tool. And so when Google says they're doing calculations, 100 septillion times faster than classical computing, they're not wrong, but they're also being very misleading because it's not a generic computational sort of technology. It's this very one-off specific computation that is not useful. So, you could not use these machines for anything. You could have all the free time you wanted on IBM's biggest quantum computer, and you don't have any ability to do it. So why invest in IonQ or Rigetti, or why short them? This is kind of my framework, and I think it sort of makes sense to me, at least. Let's see how you guys think. In the 70s, Intel came out with their processors. There were a lot of companies you've never heard of that were also coming out with similar processors at the time. And the fact that if I name these companies, you wouldn't be able to remember them mostly, unless you're a student of the semiconductor industry or something. They all sort of flamed out very quickly. And all these companies sort of tried to exist alongside Intel and failed. Intel wasn't a huge company then either, by the way, but they outcompeted everyone else. And if you notice the GPU market, there's only really 2 players, arguably 1 player. So what's going to happen with quantum? We just don't know. So to pick a winner now is even it's actually crazier than picking a winner for sort of transistor-based semiconductors in the 70s. And like we're not even in the first inning of quantum. And so to pick like, oh, okay, IonQ is going to win this race, or IBM is going to win this race, or Google's going to win this race, it's so uncertain that it's sort of preposterous to even think about. Someone will win this race. There's no doubt about that. But sort of mooning these stocks because of Google's contrived thing is very, very kind of dumb. And I think that as the dumb money figures this out, that piled into the stock, they will pile out of the stock. And they also just do this naturally. You know, after a stock's gone up a lot, it tends to just come back down because, again, there's a half-life that passes for momentum traders. There may truly be some investors that are thinking that the quantum revolution is upon us. This is just like AI. There's been many winters in quantum and many springs. And we're sort of in a winter for quantum in a lot of ways. These companies couldn't go public. They had a really hard time raising private capital, and they went public through SPACs. This is not Databricks. This is not OpenAI. This is not companies that had so much capital they didn't know what to do with it. These are companies that struggled. There was no obvious use case for quantum. Very few people wanted to wait 10, 20 years to see their investment pan out. So depending on how fast you think you can add qubits to a system, if you take Moore's law, that compute doubles every year, which is faster than Moore's law, you know, you still wouldn't get to 4 million qubits within 20 to 50 years, depending on how fast it doubles. So conservatively, you'd be looking at 50 years before you could crack 2048 RSA, which in 50 years, we will not be using 48-bit RSA, I don't think. So it's kind of a dangerous space. It's really just science fiction, really. And there have been many attempts to make, you know, non-traditional computing. There's reservoir computing. There's the stuff that 𝗩 is doing. There's, you know, analog computing in general just has been around for a long time. It's in some ways older than digital computing. So it's had this renaissance with this idea of thermodynamic computing. So, you know, there's all kinds of people trying to do optical computing or DNA computing or whatever. And the reality is, you know, NVIDIA is not going to quit. So even though right now you have this tremendous interest in like decryption, so far GPUs aren't horrible at decryption, and they will get better, and CPUs will get better. So you still have the backdrop of you know, traditional chips advancing. So that's not going to change. Now, will they catch up to the theoretical quantum capabilities? Probably not, even at really fast paces. But for what application? You know, I don't think quantum computers would be very useful for most algorithms. So again, as a trader, God only knows what will happen. But you know, I do think that people on Wall Street tend to look at this stuff and get excited, and then they ask people who really know what they're doing, and those people say, yeah, it's just not going to happen. This is really boring, and you shouldn't be interested in this. So, you know, I sort of don't have a pulse on Wall Street like I used to, mostly because I just didn't think it would be helpful. But this is one of those situations where talking to a bunch of hedge funds and seeing if they're actually buying this or shorting it would actually be very interesting, as well as long-only firms. And I think in general, given that these were SPACs and like nobody wanted to touch these for so long, I don't think that anything's changed. And I think that it's just sort of speculative money chasing. But we certainly might see real people get interested in this. But I tend to think it's not the case. And it was just people chasing the Google announcement. So that's what I think about quantum. I don't know if anybody has.
I think that your whole point about the coprocessors is very true. Like, one thing that I think is interesting is if you look at CPUs and GPUs, they're like very similar. It's a much more like recent and minor architectural fork than like going from classical computers to something like a quantum computer or a thermodynamic computer or whatever. So the way I see it is like, you had all these economically valuable problems that were just done by humans on paper or in their brain really, really inefficiently. And like, you can replace a lot of those with either CPUs or GPUs, and like maybe one will win out over the other over the course of decades. But it's very unclear to me that you can just replace a large proportion of computer tasks with another type of computer. So kind of like you said about the sound chip, I'm not even sure that any other type of processor will ever be more valuable than classical computers.
Well, what's really interesting about the GPU example is a lot of people are saying, oh, you get to own the next NVIDIA. And the problem with that theory is that NVIDIA wasn't the next NVIDIA until very recently. So NVIDIA was actually a struggling kind of crappy company until, this sort of AI revolution, deep learning revolution happened. So NVIDIA, the reason Intel never bought NVIDIA and they just sort of looked down on it was a gaming chip, and the gaming industry was just only so big, and it didn't make sense for these to be anything more than say a $5 billion or $10 billion company. And then Matmull's became the most important thing ever, and what do you know? It happens to be that they do them the best. So now it's a multi-trillion-dollar company. But that was 20 years, almost 20 years, I'd say, after the GPU was invented, and parallel processing with the GPU architecture was sort of found a bigger application, and that'll probably happen with quantum someday, right? It is almost certainly going to happen, but it's probably going to happen 20 years the same way it happened with GPUs, sort of 20 years after you have something that looks like a general purpose quantum computer, which is maybe an oxymoron or a misnomer. So I think like the idea of attaching NVIDIA to the QC boom that we're seeing, this very temporary, possibly temporary boom. In fact, I'm almost certain it's going to be temporary, because real booms and real like springs versus winters, and I would argue we've been in a quantum computing winter, including the Google quote unquote quantum supremacy paper, which got them a huge amount of flack. When that paper came out, it was, the word quantum supremacy it obviously made some DEI people pretty angry too, but it was really a kind of like thing that IBM was, for example, very upset about, because circuit sampling is not quantum supremacy. And there are people, we have friends doing, circuit sampling of Gaussian noise and things like that. And they're not saying they have any superiority. So I feel like, circuit sampling is kind of like a black eye, and they did it again, regardless. So it was just something that was surprising to me that, they're really sort of sticking to that. But in any event, I mean, I think these stocks will come back down, because the winter is really when, like, and I hate to glorify VCs because I hate them so much, but like, I think the winter's thaw when VCs will actually put like hundreds of millions of dollars to work in a space. And there is a space they're doing that in right now, and it's AI. And sometimes it's AI hardware, but it's certainly not in non-traditional computing. And, the winter's thaw then, and again, these companies had to go public through SPAC, which is, if you didn't know, the lowest quality possible way to go public. I don't even remember if these were Chamath companies or not, but regardless, they couldn't find a banker to put them through the traditional process, which is really crazy. Wall Street should be able to find you, $100 million or $200 million from high-tech investors that, in the ZERP, this was also in the ZERP peak, where like anybody could go public. They failed to do so and just did these SPACs. And, all the companies that did that, like Ginkgo and others, what is that, Virgin Galactic, all these companies' stocks dropped dramatically, because, they were sort of low quality companies. And some of these companies were basically going bankrupt. I was interested in these companies in private rounds. But, I'm a technology fan. I really love this sort of science fiction technology, but I didn't expect anything like this to be practical for a very long time. But, nurturing it along the way wouldn't be such a bad thing. As we go from 100 to 500 to 1,000 to 5,000 qubits, you start to get a little bit more utility. And I would say everybody in the chat that you can go and sign up for IBM Quantum, and they give you 10 minutes of machine time for your free sort of free account. And Qiskit and the other sort of languages or tool chain to write quantum code isn't that hard.
And if you need help, the AI code generators actually do understand it. So, there are like Manning and like O'Reilly books on writing quantum code. So, it definitely takes a little bit of adjustment to think about like Hadamard gates and C naught and different sort of primitives. And you're not going to be writing a video game on it or something like that anytime soon. But I'd encourage you to see for yourself what's the biggest number you can factor in today's top quantum computing environments. You can get the IonQ computer for $7,000 an hour on AWS Bracket or Breakit. So in Bracket, you have to register it and like I don't know, pre-order it or whatever, but you can reserve, I guess that's the word, you can reserve it for an hour. And if you want, you could split it with a friend or have your corporation do it or whatever, but you'd probably want to have all your code ready. And you just, they honestly should break it down into minutes, but I can understand that that's why they want to make the most money. But these programs run in a second or two, even if you run thousands of iterations. And you'll see that these programs are you really can't do anything. And once you do that, I think you realize, like, why would I pay $7 billion for a company that has one working quantum computer? And this is IonQ. And there's people that think that the ion trap is just not going to work, period. And that transmon superconducting is the way to go. So, nobody's sure, nobody knows. But you have you're so far away from success that 7 billion is just a stupid number. You don't know anything about having logical qubits versus physical qubits. You don't know if you can actually get to 1 million qubits, physical qubits. We don't know what the best substrates are. We don't know, anything. But so 6 billion, 7 billion, that's money that would make sense if you knew there was a path to, say, being the next NVIDIA. There's no known path here to like actually get there. We just don't know. And so typically when you have something like this, this is sort of a crazy price. It's a very bubble-like price. Could it get bigger and crazier? It's hard for me to fathom the science experiment that's worth 20 billion or something like that. A long time ago, there was a company. So here's a decent analog. There's a company called Human Genome Sciences, known by its stock ticker HGSS and affectionately known by traders as 𝗥𝗂. HGSI, sorry. Human Genome Sciences, this was Craig Venter's company that decoded the human genome very quickly. So in essence, what happened with 𝗥𝗂 was that they decoded the genome. The company had this like $20 billion company, $20 billion valuation. And it ended up sort of falling to, I want to say around $1 billion. And they had just pretty much trad drugs that were like very basic, and they eked out a win on one trad drug and sold the company for like $2 billion. But it went down 90%, and they basically had to be traditional again. And so I think something like that's going to happen to all these quantum computing companies. Most of them will go to zero, but one or two of them may sort of like drop 95% and eke out an existence over the next couple decades. But it's just so unlikely that these companies can find a way to succeed. So that's kind of how I feel about quantum computing.
I think you're kind of talking around this point, which is the same way Steve Jobs talked about Xerox PARC and the same way that OpenAI has essentially used the technology that Google developed is just because you know how to develop the technology and push it doesn't mean you know how to monetize it. And so if we're only talking about qubits and we're not talking about what are the new tasks that are being monetized based on this technology being developed. And so maybe Google gets a pump because they put out this hype video, but they've already kind of demonstrated in the AI space that just because they can push a technology doesn't mean they can monetize it. Arguably, Microsoft has done a much better job monetizing by partnering with OpenAI, the technology that Google developed themselves. And so I think I think you're kind of describing this hype cycle, which is okay. There's great new technology that gets developed in the ecosystem. Everyone thinks and fantasizes about the current tasks we could accomplish if the technology went further. But ultimately, where all the value ends up getting created is someone comes along and figures out a new task that can be done using the technology at a certain breakpoint, and essentially kind of siphon that off and do their own thing that no one else was thinking of yet. And so you get the hype on the technology being developed. People realize, okay, there's no actual use cases yet, but the technology keeps getting developed in the background. And so that's kind of this winter you described. And then eventually someone comes along, they're really creative. They find a small niche to start building out a new value prop in. That's where the VCs start to dive in again and actually grow the space. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and we've seen that cycle before. But to me, like all it takes is Navy or Army or NSA or some of these customers saying, we're not getting anywhere. We're dropping our purchase, or even keeping purchasing flat is a disaster for these stocks, because like IonQ is 40 million in revenue. If that goes to 20 or something like that, the stock goes to 99% down. Even if it stays flat for 3 or 4 years, that's a disaster. So superconducting, 3D printing, these are other kind of miracle technologies that didn't end up making stock market winners. So this is like very reminiscent of that to me. So, I'm short the whole industry, and I'm actually a huge fan of this industry. So, I have a huge heart for, frontier science, but I also, don't like buying high prices. This is something that sort of belongs in academia or in corporate academia, like, Google's sort of labs and Microsoft's labs and so forth. And, IBM's trying to, they're probably doing the best job of all, them and Honeywell. They're all trying to do something, but like simulations is another space that could make a lot of sense for quantum computing. But if you know the simulation space from pharma, at least, there actually isn't a ton of benefit to doing simulations. So if you run something like GROMACS or AMBER or other molecular dynamics simulation software, you kind of get the gist of these things relatively quickly. Would it be cool to simulate like many seconds of reality? Sure, of course it would be. But like if you have a protein ensemble, and you want to simulate, I don't know, 100 microseconds or 100 nanoseconds or something like that, you can do it, and you get what you need to know. You're on the atomic level. A lot of things don't change over huge time scales, and you get what you want. And this idea that like pharma or material science would change a lot with a quantum simulator is just not real to me. And then, between that and encryption, you're really running out of stuff to do with these machines that's useful. There are no other obvious kind of killer apps. Some people say the traveling salesman problem is a good example of like a very NP hard problem that quantum computers could do better at. But the reality there is that we have very good approximations for traveling salesmen. So the exact solutions are not available, but without maybe something like a quantum computer. But the close enough solutions that we use now are available. And unless you have a very bizarre traveling salesman problem, which I think don't exist, like even UPS or FedEx or Amazon, like that have very complex routing problems, they get good enough performance, and they don't need a quantum computer to get a better one. So it really feels kind of stupid to me that like maybe we vacuum all the data that China has and they vacuum all our data, and we keep this in some, I don't know, big S3 bucket, and in 50 years we can decrypt it. Well, that's a little silly too, because if you think about the cable leak that came with WikiLeaks, like that was supposed to be all this like really secret cables that were like super, sensitive, and it turns out there was nothing in there that was interesting at all. And I think people sort of underestimate the value of decrypting old information and things like that. And by the time it's 2050 and 2060 and we have working quantum computers, we'll be on lattice-based encryption or some other post-quantum technology, and the mousetrap just gets harder. And so the other funny thing is, I mean, you theoretically could do 4,000-bit RSA, you could do 9,000-bit RSA, every power of 2, 40, 96, 80, whatever. You can keep going up and up. It gets a little impractical at some point, but you certainly could keep growing key size, and that's what elliptic curves are there for too. They're smaller size to the same hardness, theoretically at least. So you get some really big elliptic curves that keep your data safe, even in the old paradigm. So that's without moving to a new form of cryptography, which of course, is very important for cryptocurrency, where quantum computer cracking, so to speak, Bitcoin would be something that would be somewhat alarming. But there are some protections there. There's the old P2PK method, which reveals public keys in the transaction ledger in the program or the script. So the P2PK has been basically obsolete since the advent of Taproot, but with P2PK, there's still plenty of old P2PK transactions that you could theoretically reverse, but you're still talking about like 20 years from now, and then theoretically, once that happens, like the Bitcoin, community can fork, even hard fork if necessary, but just fork the sort of ledger into a new status or something like that. So it'd be fairly easy to see like somebody who cracked the entire thing.